Raymond Green, who went by Ray, was born in the 1950s and married a woman named Maggie, and they would have one child together named Tracy. Ray, who had done 2 tours in Vietnam, began his career riding bulls and bareback broncos. Those closest to him described him as a real cowboy who loved animals and always had a special way with them. He loved the simple country life and always felt at home there. He went on to become a renowned horse breeder and trainer and built that into a successful business. He ran this business from his 200-acre San Antonio, Texas ranch and had over 70 horses. To give you an idea of how tough Ray was, one time a 12-foot alligator had made its way onto his property, and after animal control couldn't capture it, Ray, with his bare hands, captured the alligator and placed it in his barn. In May 2002, Maggie died in an unfortunate accident when a bridge collapsed in Oklahoma. She was on her way home from barrel racing with her horses when a barge slammed into a bridge on Interstate 40, plunging nearly a dozen vehicles 75 feet into the water. Ray called Maggie his Rose and was extremely devastated by her death. He said he missed his Rose, and his daughter Tracy said her father's light had gone out. A lawsuit on behalf of the victims was filed, with Ray receiving over $1 million. About 2 months after the death of Maggie, a woman by the name of Danielle, who went by Danny, started showing up on the ranch every day. She was a longtime client of Ray's who had hired him back in 2001 to trim and shoe her horses. Danny was 22 years younger than Ray, but provided him with companionship after the death of Maggie. In August 2003, Danny divorced her then husband, and then in May 2004, Ray and her eloped. His daughter, Tracy, was never a fan of Danny's because after the marriage, she strangely began wearing her late mother's clothes and jewelry. Danny was big into horse riding and even had her sights set on competing in the Olympic sport of dressage. Danny had researched and found that ground zero for dressage was in Palm Beach, Florida, so she convinced Ray to use the money from the settlement to move there. They purchased a house with stables for her to train for the U.S. Olympic trials. She was very talented and would train from daylight to dark. In their spare time, they were active members of a cowboy action shooting club. Danny was very proficient and competitive in target shooting and would travel all across Florida, competing in competitions and events. Other members of the club said they were loved by everyone involved, but they also described Danny as a top shooter with an extremely competitive nature. Unfortunately, in 2008, when the economy collapsed, it devastated Ray's horse business, causing them to fall into severe financial debt. In order to keep the house in Florida, they were forced to take out a second mortgage. They began to struggle to keep up with their lifestyle and their action shooting hobby. When the money ran out, Ray obtained a job mowing property for their homeowners association. He also performed various other duties for individuals in the neighborhood in order to earn extra income. All the while, Tracy was unaware of the financial trouble that Ray was going through. She had been trying to contact her father for the past few years, but had been unsuccessful. Come to find out, Danny had strangely blocked Tracy on the cell phone that she and Ray shared and had also suspiciously blocked postal mail and emails from her, which Ray was unaware of. Danny's dreams of going to the Olympics had basically died. In 2012, while still in Florida, Danny received a devastating phone call that both her parents were terminally ill with cancer. This forced them to sell their home in Florida for a huge loss so that Danny could return to Indiana. Ray would then move in with a friend and continue the mowing business along with the other odd jobs. A friend, who was helping with the move back to Indiana, said that he saw a very dark side of Danny. He said she would constantly berate Ray in a very ugly tone. He even mentioned to others that he wouldn't be surprised if Danny murdered Ray one day. After she returned to Indiana, Ray would continue to take all the money he was making from the business and send it to Danny. Now that Ray was alone in Florida, Tracy was finally able to resume communication with her father after 8 long years. He even traveled to Texas to visit her and her children, which angered Danny. In 2013, Danny's parents passed away, leaving her with a shared inheritance of 300 acres along with a rundown farmhouse in dire need of repairs. Ray then left Florida behind and moved with Danny into a trailer on her share of the property. Danny wanted to use the newly obtained property to build another horse farm, while Ray decided to get his trucker's license. Ray and Danny came up with a plan to divorce so that he could receive Maggie's Social Security benefits. Even after divorcing, they remained together on the property. On May 28, 2014, the police were called to the property after Ray's 84-year-old mother Betty called to report that her daughter-in-law had called her and said that Ray was bitten in the neck yesterday by their German Shepherd Jazzy, and she couldn't find him or the dog. Danny also called other family members and friends, telling them the same story. At this point, the police drove out to the property to check on Ray. When they arrived, they found Danny going about her daily activities as if nothing was wrong. Danny agreed to let them search the property, but when they came to a padlocked metal box, she refused to let them open it, claiming it was Ray's and she couldn't give consent. With no other options, investigators left to seek out a search warrant. After returning with a search warrant and opening the metal box, they were shocked to find Ray's remains. This caused Danny to immediately change her story, saying 2 days prior, she shot Ray in self-defense. She then began to claim he was abusive, and this is what ultimately led to his death. Investigators then had her reenact the events that led up to the shooting.
He fell more on his right side, actually totally on his right side. His legs were up, and as I fell on him like this, my hand, I don't know if you can see, my hand was like this.
Danny claims that on Memorial Day, May 26th, she awoke from sleeping on the couch around 6 or 6:30 a.m. and went to the bathroom. On the way to the bathroom, she said she noticed a revolver on the nightstand. She claims that when she came out, she was met by an enraged Ray who said, "I'm going to kill you. You need to die," and lunged for her. She allegedly grabbed the gun from the nightstand, and he fell on the bed, but then claimed not to remember pulling the trigger or hearing the gunshots. After shooting him, she then says she got scared and took off running with the gun. She then reloaded it, came back in the room, and said he started to get up, so she shot him 5 more times, causing him to collapse and die. Interestingly, as part of her shooting competition, she was trained to shoot 5 times, reload, and shoot 5 more times. 8 days after the shooting, a medical examiner ruled Ray's death a homicide, and Danny was arrested and charged with his murder. However, Danny still had one last secret to reveal. After moving back to Indiana, Danny secretly started a long-distance relationship with a married member of the shooting club by the name of George Mann, aka Angus McNasty. They would communicate multiple times a day by phone, email, and other electronic means, and even pass sexual innuendos back and forth. They spent hours a day on the phone and exchanged hundreds of emails back and forth. She also confided in George that Ray was standing in the way of her dreams and that she wanted to leave him. She searched Google on how to murder a man with a .38 and allegedly even discussed the details with George. These are George's exact words when asked about this Google search. "She's on a remote property. You're a mile from the nearest person. No one's going to hear you scream. So we were talking about self-defense. She was doing research on things that we had discussed." Prosecutors believe that Danielle murdered Ray because she wanted to start a new life with George. However, to this day, George denies that they were anything more than just friends and claims the relationship was completely platonic, despite him allegedly telling investigators he was in love with her. The details between Danny and George are very murky, and he was never charged with any crime. As for Danny, during the trial, her defense was that the trauma she endured at the hands of Ray caused her to lie about his manner of death. She also stuck to the story of self-defense, but there was no evidence of abuse. However, there was evidence that showed Ray was actually sleeping when he was murdered. However, a jury wasn't buying it, and 43-year-old Danny was sentenced to 60 years in prison. In a tragic coincidence, Ray's death occurred on the 12th anniversary of Maggie's death. To this day, Jazzy the German Shepherd has never been found. Anne Maguire was born on April 5, 1953. After graduating from secondary education, she went on to university to become a teacher. After graduation, Anne became a professor at Corpus Christi Catholic College in Halton Moor, Leeds, England. By 2014, Anne was married to Don Maguire and had 2 beautiful daughters, and had been teaching at the school for the last 40 years. Her students described her as a fantastic teacher who couldn't do enough for people. They said she always wanted the best for her students, and they considered her one of the best teachers at the school. While Anne loved teaching, she was set to retire in the fall of 2014. However, she would sadly never get the chance. On April 28, 2014, while Anne was in the middle of teaching her Spanish class, one of her students walked to the front and shockingly stabbed her multiple times with a kitchen knife. Terrified, students began screaming and fled the classroom. Anne, in shock after the stabbing, ran to a nearby office where Susan Francis, who heard the screams, saw her, pulled her in, and quickly closed the door behind her to prevent the suspect from getting in. At that point, the suspect gave up and returned to the classroom and shockingly told a friend that it was a shame that he had not been successful in murdering Mrs. Maguire. The suspect was a student by the name of William Cornick, or Will as his friends and family called him. Upon being arrested, he admitted to having plans to kill Anne Maguire and 2 other teachers, and even brought a bottle of whiskey to the school to celebrate with after the murders. Sadly, as Anne lay dying on the office floor, she said, "I can't breathe. I'm dying." As paramedics arrived and were taking her out of the school, Anne stopped breathing. After arriving at Leeds General Infirmary, a trauma team continued trying to resuscitate Anne for 40 minutes before finally giving up and pronouncing her dead. Meanwhile, Will was arrested and had a very strange and twisted conversation with police officer Katie Miles. She said he first asked her for some ice for his hand, which he hurt during the attack. He then asked her what her favorite movie was, before saying he loved adrenaline sports, and asked her what her favorite adrenaline sport was. The whole time, Will never showed remorse and continued smiling, as if nothing was wrong. It turns out Will had a deep-seated grudge against Anne, and had even put out a message on Facebook asking if anyone was interested in killing her for a tenner, which is a 10-pound note in the UK. Will came from a broken home, but it was said that both parents remained very supportive of him. Will began attending Corpus Christi during year 7. His peers said he was always polite and had perfect attendance. He had gotten in trouble on 5 different occasions for misbehaving, but nothing too serious during his 4.5 years at the school. It was also said that Will was very gifted academically. However, all that changed during a vacation to Cornwall, England in 2013. While on the trip, Will collapsed and was taken to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with diabetes. This apparently turned his world upside down and led to a complete change in his personality. He originally had plans to join the army, but found out that he was no longer qualified due to his diabetes diagnosis. His mental state had gotten so severe that he even began briefly harming himself. On Christmas of the same year was when he began talking to friends about wanting to brutally murder Anne Maguire. After the murder, authorities discovered that many students had been aware of Will's plan. He had even asked a classmate to film the attack. One student had plans to report him, but decided not to after Will threatened to kill him. On the day of the attack, students saw Will with a kitchen knife stashed up his sleeve, but they never tried to stop him. Allegedly, one student had reported the threat to another teacher, but sadly the warning came too late. Students never reported him because they never felt he was serious and chalked it up to him having a dark sense of humor. In total, 10 students were aware of Will's plans. In the end, the court sentenced Will to life in prison with a requirement to spend at least 20 years in custody. Psychiatrists have said that Will has a lack of empathy for his victim and a complete disregard for her death. To date, he has never shown any remorse for his actions, even though his family claims otherwise. Shockingly, when Will was asked how he thought the Maguire family was feeling, he replied that he couldn't give a shit. Anne Maguire's husband, Don, continued to push for inquiries into why students failed to report the strange behavior, and it was finally approved. Once the inquiry was complete, it basically stated the obvious: the killing was unlawful, and opportunities to prevent her murder were clearly missed. Seath Tyler Jackson was born on February 3, 1996, in Bellevue, Florida. He had 2 older brothers and attended Bellevue High School. 15-year-old Seath was a regular teenager with dreams of becoming a UFC fighter one day. His family described him as very kind-hearted and said that he loved to make people laugh. In December 2011, 14-year-old Seath began dating a girl named Amber Wright. Seath's parents weren't exactly happy about the relationship and found Amber to be somewhat manipulative. And of course, like most parents' intuition, they were spot on. In March of 2011, just 3 months into the relationship, Amber cheated on Seath with 18-year-old Michael Bargo. Unfortunately, during my research, I stumbled across 2 conflicting stories. The first story said that Seath was pissed and confronted Michael about the infidelity, and a fight broke out, with Seath coming out on top. However, a second story said that Michael and Amber's stepbrother, Kyle Hooper, challenged Seath to a fight at their female friend, Charlie Ailey's home. When Seath and his friend approached the trailer in a rural area, they heard a gunshot and left. Allegedly, Michael shot a gun inside the trailer in order to scare them. What we do know for sure is that after the breakup, Seath and Amber began trash-talking each other on social media, with Seath accusing her of being a promiscuous meth addict. To which she replied, "It takes a real man to accept being broken up with." After the breakup, Michael and Amber allegedly began dating. At the time, Michael was living with 18-year-old Charlie and 16-year-old Kyle, and Amber was known to stay over quite frequently. Charlie had them move in to help with rent, while her husband was in jail. As for Michael, he was under the impression that Seath had abused Amber during their 3-month relationship. One can only assume this came from Amber herself, which is probably why Michael truly believed it, but it was allegedly not true. However, all it did was fuel the hate he had towards Seath. At some point during all of this, Kyle's girlfriend, Alyssa, suddenly broke up with him over the phone. Upset, he showed up at her home wanting to talk, but instead, he found Seath in her bed. Now even more upset, he left and stole Seath's bike in the process. Seath allegedly retaliated by threatening to burn down Kyle's home. On April 17th, with everything reaching a boiling point, Michael, along with Kyle, Amber, Charlie, and 20-year-old Justin Soto, came up with a plan to murder Seath. The plan was for Amber to lure Seath to Charlie's home under the pretense that they could work things out, but asked him to keep their meeting a secret. Seath was immediately suspicious and replied, "Amber, if you have me jumped, I will never give you the time of day." However, Amber was persistent and convinced Seath that she would never do such a thing and just wanted them back together. So Seath agreed and headed to the trailer where Charlie lived. When he arrived, Charlie answered the door and showed him to the living room. That's when Kyle and Justin came out of a back room and started beating him with a 2x4 and a wooden axe handle. Michael then shot Seath twice with his .22 caliber revolver. At this point, Seath was able to get away and ran out of the house and was almost on the road when Justin tackled him. Michael then shot him again. Kyle and Justin drug him back inside and placed him in the bathtub, all the while continuing to beat him with the wooden objects. Once in the tub, they broke both his kneecaps in order to fit him in the sleeping bag they had. However, to their surprise, Seath was still alive, so Michael shot him several more times before finally putting him in the sleeping bag and setting it ablaze in a fire pit out back. You might think that at some point during all of this, that a responsible adult might have stepped in and stopped it all. But you'd be wrong. Shockingly, 37-year-old James Havens, who was Amber and Kyle's stepfather, knew about the plot in advance and agreed to help. On the morning of April 18th, he showed up with cinder blocks and cables in the back of his truck. The remains were then shoveled into 3 paint buckets and put into the back of Havens' truck. He then drove Justin and Michael to a rock quarry in Ocala, where they sunk the buckets with the cinder blocks. The rest of the group stayed back at Charlie's home, and using bleach, they proceeded to rid the trailer of evidence. Once their plan was done, everyone involved went on their merry way. On April 18th, the same day Seath's remains were disposed of, his parents quickly reported him missing. That very night, his disappearance was shown on the local news, which Kyle was watching with his mother. Kyle immediately confessed to his mother that he knew Seath was dead and that he was involved. Thankfully, she did the right thing and called the police. Authorities quickly rounded up Amber, Kyle, and Charlie. Allegedly, they were all 3 placed into a holding cell and began talking about the murder, with Kyle still saying that Seath deserved to die. Michael, on the other hand, decided to skip town and asked Havens to drive him to Stark, Florida, to stay with his out-of-town girlfriend's family. Shockingly, once there, Michael began to brag about his crime, telling 4 separate family members and a neighbor what he had done. Police finally caught up with him the very next day and arrested him. Once in jail, he again continued to brag about the murder and told 2 additional witnesses about his part in the crime. Once a search warrant was issued for Charlie's home, investigators quickly found the murder weapon, along with burnt human remains, in the fire pit. They also found Charlie's DNA in the blood mixture left behind in the bathroom and Kyle's DNA in a blood mixture in the living room that also contains Seath's DNA. Furthermore, Michael's DNA was located in blood found on the kitchen ceiling. Upon searching the Ocala rock quarry, authorities found a 5-gallon bucket with a plastic bag floating in the water. A diving team was dispatched, and they were able to recover the other 2 paint buckets. In the end, all 6 participants were arrested. Even though Amber and Kyle were minors, they were tried as adults. Amber, Kyle, Justin, and Charlie were all given life sentences for their role in Seath's murder, and Havens pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact. In 2020, Charlie's sentence was vacated, allowing her to plead down to a lesser charge. She had already served 9 years in prison and was released that same year. As for Michael, he was given the death sentence, becoming Florida's youngest inmate on death row. And in 2021, that sentence was upheld by the Supreme Court.